So we're going to start now. So before getting started, I'd like to ask for a brief moment of acknowledgement in the context of a conference that invites consideration of racism, pandemics, and other struggles with a focus on Latinx in Latin America. It is imperative to acknowledge our location here in what is now called Central Minnesota. Though we are gathering virtually, the host institutions of the College of St. Benedictine and St. John's University are located on the lands that were within the ancestral homelands and were walked by the Dakota and the Anishinaabe peoples for centuries before the arrival of European settlers. I would encourage us all to strive to deepen our awareness of the harms caused by displacement and forced assimilation of Native peoples in this very region and the ongoing legacy of their harm as it is felt in our neighboring Native communities. So welcome everyone to the keynote address of the 53rd North Central Council of Latin Americanists Conference. I have a few announcements and then I will welcome our keynote speaker. First, if you have enjoyed the conference so far, please consider becoming a member of the NCCLA if you're not one yet. Memberships are important to allow us to bring the conference, to organize our teaching and learning workshops, and to continue the great work of maintaining a network of Latin Americanists in the North Central US and beyond. I want to once again thank all of those helping to organize this conference, but I want to especially thank Megan Sheehan for being our program chair. I invited her to be a program chair and she graciously accepted. This invitation happened in 2019, which now seems like a decade ago. And it did not entail organizing our first online conference in the middle of a modified teaching schedule at our institution. Dr. Shea has taken all this in stride and helped organize a phenomenal conference, one that may serve as a model as a transition to the post-COVID way of doing conferences. So please give a virtual round of applause for Dr. Sheehan. I also now want to announce the winner of our collaborative research award that is given to a research paper completed collaboratively between a faculty member and a student, undergraduate or graduate. This year's award goes to Dr. Nancy Gates Madison and Mackenzie Zenk of Luther College for the paper Destabilizing the Binary Rhetoric of Migration in Yuri Herrera's Señales que precederan al fin del mundo, Signs Preceding the End of the World. The three reviewers unanimously agree that the paper is highly deserving of the NCCLA's Collaborative Research Award. In it, the authors skillfully analyze the novel. They subvert the opposing binary categories in dominant narratives about immigrants and their migration journey across the US-Mexico border, south to north, through a fascinating application of their theoretical framework, Locura Semántica. They argue that the dualistic rhetoric of migrations is insufficient to express the complicated reality of border crosses and the migrant journey, enriching the paper with nuanced contextual and social science perspectives. They conclude that the North-South relationship is interconnected and the migration journey levels out difference between North and South, thus transforming both people and place. Please give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Gates Madison and Mackenzie Zenk. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, just a reminder that, as the presentation goes on, feel free to interact either through the Q&A button or the chat button. And then at the end of the talk, we're going to have some time for a Q&A. So having those questions, they'll be very helpful to contextualize this discussion. So I'm now excited to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Gladys Mitchell-Walthour. They will talk to us about Afro-descendants, crisis, and resistance in Latin America. A perfect fit for this year's conference theme of racism, pandemics, and other struggles for Latinx in Latin America. Gladys Mitchell-Walthour is an associate professor of public policy and political economy in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She's a political scientist specializing in Afro-Brazilian political behavior, Black racial identity, discrimination, affirmative action, and Bolsa Familia. She was the 2018-2020 president of the Brazil Studies Association. She is the co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. She published the book, The Politics of Blackness, Racial Identity, and Political Behavior in Contemporary Brazil by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And she has published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Latin American Politics and Society, Politics, Groups, and Identities, and the National Political Science Review. She was a Lehman visiting scholar at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University in 2014. And she holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, and a BA from Duke University. I am 100% academic starstruck by her work, and I'm honored to present to you Dr. Gladys Mitchell-Walthour.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pedro Santos and Dr. Bruce Campbell for this invitation, as well as all of the supporting institutions. It's great to do this, especially during this moment. And I also want to thank all the participants. I just saw a friend and former student who said hello. So thank you for everyone who is here. And then of course, thank you for those who will watch this later on. So Professor Santos is actually going to run the PowerPoint for me. And I really appreciate that. So as mentioned, today I'm going to talk about Afro-descendants, crises, and resistance in Latin America. Next slide. The first thing that I want to do is to say the names of some people who have been killed by police officers and in Latin America, but also I added on this very young person who was recently killed in Chicago. So I'm just going to say their names and then take a brief minute to pause to honor their lives. João Alberto Freitas, Agatha Felix, Anderson Arboleda, and Adam Toledo. Thank you. Next slide. So this is the order of the presentation. First, I'm going to talk about Afro-descendants in Latin America. I'm going to talk about their presence in terms of population size, racial democracy, history of resistance, and then I will talk about the current status of Afro-descendants in Latin America. I will also talk about current mobilization. And then lastly, I will close discussing transnational activism. Next slide. So in this slide, this is from the Pew Research Center, but I really just wanted to show that throughout Latin America, there are African descendants, with Brazil being the country that has the largest number of Afro-descendants. And I know the numbers are small, but these are in thousands. So for example, in Brazil, that's 97 million. So as the dots are larger, that just indicates there are larger populations. And then of course, smaller populations, the smaller the dot is. So you can see that Brazil has a large population of African descendants, as well as Venezuela, Colombia, Dominican Republic, and then some of the countries with smaller percentages are countries such as Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and such. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about this notion of racial democracy, and it looks different according to the country that you are in. But in general, this is the notion that there is no racism. And that is due to people being racially mixed, having a history of racial mixture. And the idea is that if you do not have distinct racial groups, then you can't have racism, right? So of course, we all know that, of course, you can still have racism, but this is kind of the what scholars now call the myth of racial democracy. And you can still see this among people in Latin America who will say, oh, well, we don't have racism and things like that because, you know, my great-great-grandfather or my great-great-grandmother was Black, or they will, you know, point to having different people of different skin tones in their families and things like that. But again, it looks different in different countries. And what I mean by saying that is, so even when people are talking about that racial mixture, in some places, such as, for example, Mexico, and of course, this is changing with, you know, more Black movement activism, but historically, people would only talk about kind of the ancestry as being European and indigenous, and leaving out African ancestry. But of course, now you have more people acknowledging African ancestry, but that's what I mean when I say that it looks differently depending on the country. The other thing that I want to mention is that in this presentation, I won't be covering all Latin American countries because that would be a course. So you will notice that sometimes I just refer to certain countries. Next slide. So in terms of Africans who were enslaved and brought to Latin America, 10.7 million enslaved Africans survived and disembarked in North America, South America, and the Caribbean. 5.1 million Africans were enslaved and imported to Brazil. And that's compared to about 778,000 in Cuba, 100,000 in Peru. And then of course the US is not part of Latin America, but I included it just so we have a reference point. So about 338,000 Africans were enslaved in the US. So you can see that most enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil. Next slide. I think it's really important, especially today, as more media networks are talking about Black mobilization throughout Latin America. I think it's really important that we make sure that we acknowledge that there has always been resistance from Africans and African descendants in Latin America. So some of these examples are Maroon communities, such as the Palenque communities in Colombia, also in Mexico. So the second picture is a picture of Gaspar Yanga, who was a leader of a Maroon community in Veracruz, Mexico. And then of course, Zumbi was one of the leader of Palmares, which was a Quilombo or Maroon community in Brazil. So people ran away, set up their own communities. So that was, Africans and African descendants seeking liberation, resisting slavery. And then of course, there were also revolts. So there was a very famous one in Bahia, which was led by African Muslims. And so that the last picture is really representing that, as well as, other revolts that Africans and African descendants had. Next slide. So before I go into my presentation, I really just wanted to acknowledge that there is a lot of work on this topic, and it goes across disciplines. So it has really been great to see how much people are publishing on anti-racism and discrimination, Blackness through in Latin America. So I'm just going to name some of these authors, but there are really too many to name. So one is Flavia Rios and Marcia Lima, Ana Flavia Pinto, Mariela Cotito, Ana Araújo, Dalila Negreiros, Euderquis Minoso, Christina Su, Tanya Golash Boza, Tiana Paschel, Tanya Saunders, Daniel Cleveland, Kwame Dixon, and Ollie Johnson. They have a really great edited volume. And then of course my book was mentioned, but I really wanted to highlight this work, that really rich work that people are doing. Next slide. So in terms of the status of Afro-descendants in Latin America, I'm going to talk about just 3 countries here. But in Brazil, they have the second largest African descendant population outside of Nigeria. The country is 56% Afro-Brazilian. 65% of those in poverty are Afro-Brazilians. And then in terms of extreme poverty, 75% of those in extreme poverty are Afro-Brazilians. In 2016, 22% of whites had a college degree compared to 8.8% of Afro-Brazilians. And this is actually a huge improvement. If you were to look at Brazil 20 or 30 years ago, that percentage was around 2%. So this, is of course still extremely low, but this is an improvement from the past. In terms of Colombia, Afro-Colombians are 10.6% of the population. They are 41% of those living in poverty, and 30% of Afro-Colombian households lack water and sanitation services. I do want to mention, though, that if you go into certain communities on the coast of Colombia, this percentage is going to be much higher. But this is, and again, we all have, when we're looking at these data, we have to remember that this is census data. So in places where, Blackness is denigrated, people don't want to identify as Black. So some of these percentages are much lower than actual populations. In terms of Peru, 3.6% of the population is Afro-Peruvian. Afro-Peruvians, 34% of Afro-Peruvians live in poverty, and then less than 2% of Afro-Peruvians have finished college. Next slide. In terms of Black movement activism in Latin America, activism takes place in a number of ways. So one of those is that people, Black activists had census campaigns and continue to. So as late as 2010, there were census campaigns, but in the late 1990s, there were campaigns. And these campaigns were both to advocate for categories that would really capture the categories that Afro-descendants use in everyday language, but it was also to get people to actually check those boxes that would indicate African ancestry. And the categories change from country to country. So in Bolivia, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Honduras, Panama, Uruguay, there were these census campaigns. And an example is in Brazil, what they advocated for was to include the term negro, which is a much broader term. So activists weren't successful at getting negro on the census, but they were successful at really trying to get people to choose the two available categories that would basically mark African ancestry. And those categories were Black, Preto, and Pardo. Pardo is a term that's, indicating racial mixture. But some people, but it's still a broad term. So it doesn't necessarily mean that someone checking the Pardo box is, multiracial or biracial in the sense that we might understand in the US. I've met Brazilians who, they will say, oh, well, my certificate says Pardo, even though they're my skin complexion. And then, of course, you can see very light skinned people who also identify as Pardo. So, some of these categories are still ambiguous. But the point here is that is one way of activism, is to actually raise consciousness among Afro-descendants for them to take pride. And there have just been some wonderful campaigns with people doing that. Another is that activists have had media campaigns to raise awareness about racism. And this has taken place, in a number of countries: Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. Again, the idea is for people to challenge that discourse that I talked about earlier in terms of people denying that racism exists in Latin America. And then you have direct action, such as protest and mobilization. And this is really people going out into the street and protesting. And it can be for a number of things. Of course, a huge one is police brutality, where people will go out into the street and protest against these, practices of white supremacy. The other two that I want to mention is through music. So hip hop music, for an example, is where you have artists making music where people talk about Blackness, where they talk about racism, and they really encourage Afro-descendants to embrace their, skin color, hair type, things like this. And you also have artists who they're not only talking about racism, but they talk about intersectional isms, such as homophobia, sexism, and things like that. So you can also see that and hear that in the music. And then the other one that I wanted to mention is digital activism. So you have YouTubers, and I just have three pictures of some Brazilian YouTubers who talk about, issues of skin color, issues that Black LGBTQ plus face, issues that Black women face. And, you have a lot of young people that are actually engaged in what I would call digital activism. So what I want to do is so that you all can actually hear and see some of this music, is that we're going to watch two. So the first one, we'll just watch about 50 seconds, and then the other one about 2 minutes.
Menina pretinha, exótica não é linda. Você não é bonitinha. Você é uma rainha. Menina pretinha, exótica não é linda. Você não é bonitinha. Você é uma rainha. Devolva minhas bonecas, quero brincar com elas. Minhas bonecas preto que fizeram com elas. Vou me divertir enquanto eu sou pequena. Barbie é legal, mas eu prefiro a máquina africana. Com uma história do griot, sou negra e tenho orgulho da minha cor africana. Com uma história do griot, sou negra e tenho orgulho da minha cor.
Okay, so that was MC Sophia. I just love her. And she was basically talking about embracing African culture. She was saying that little Black girls aren't just a little pretty, but they are little queens. She was also saying that she's proud of her color. She's proud to be Black. You can go ahead and play the second one.
Moro no campeonato alemão, jogo bola, soltar pipa, desenhar.
O que você quer ser quando você crescer?
Eu ser médico.
Everything gonna be all right this morning. Oh yeah. Everything gonna be all right this morning.
Eu sou o primeiro ritmo a formar pretos ricos. O primeiro ritmo que tornou pretos livres. Anel no dedo em cada um dos 5. Vento na minha cara, eu me sinto vivo. A partir de agora considero tudo blues. O samba é blues, o rock é blues, o jazz é blues. O funk é blues, o soul é blues, eu sou Exu do blues. Tudo que quando era preto era do demônio e depois virou branco, foi aceito, eu vou chamar de blues. É isso, entenda. Jesus é blues.
Falei mesmo.
A prata é um metal com poder de reflexão muito elevado. Do latim argentum significa brilhante. Nossa pele é de prata. Ela reflete luz. Um brilho tão intenso que eu me pergunto por que o ouro é tão querido e a prata subvalorizada. Alguns hão de responder que é pela prata ser encontrada com mais facilidade. Reflita. O Brasil tem uma população de negros maior que a de brancos. Temos menos valor por ser maioria? A ironia da maioria virá minoria. A prata é um metal puro. Eu realmente não entendo essa necessidade da procura do ouro.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. So again, in the second video, it's also a video that's really embracing Blackness. And the older guy is asking, why is it that that silver is undervalued since it's, there's more silver in the world. And then he compares that to Brazil having more Afro-Brazilians, but that they are undervalued. And so he's saying we are the silver people. But again, in both of these videos, you can see that through music, they are talking about Blackness and in a very positive way, in a way to empower people of African descent. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of just activism in general, I wanted to talk a little bit about the results of that activism over the years. And so in terms of education, there have been affirmative action policies in universities. And so, for example, in Brazil, public federal universities now have quotas. And most of these, well, all of these are class-based quotas, but they have sub-quotas for Afro-Brazilians. And in terms of class-based quotas, those are quotas for students from public schools. And then with the sub-quotas, they're supposed to match the demographics of the states. In Colombia, they have university credits that are awarded to low-income Afro-Colombians. And some universities have affirmative action policies for Indigenous and Afro-Colombian students. But the individual university determines the number of quota seats. So I think about 13 universities have some form of quotas in Colombia. Most students qualify based on class, and there are some scholarships for economically disadvantaged students to attend universities in Peru, but it's not clear what the impact has been on Afro-Peruvian students. So those are just some examples, but there are other places throughout Latin America where some universities have implemented some form of quotas. It has increased the presence of Afro-Brazilians in universities. And so there have been some media reports that Afro-Brazilian students now outnumber white Brazilian students at public universities. But again, this is based on self-identification. So some universities do have an interview process where you have to, for those people who want quota seats, you have to be interviewed, but most universities do not. So really anybody, you can check whatever box you want to. And Salas Augusto dos Santos has been doing some work on looking at fraud at some of the universities. So it's still not, the numbers aren't clear in terms of how many people would actually be considered, Afro-Brazilian outside of how they check the box. There has also been an implementation of the teaching of Afro-descendant history or Black history in some countries. And so Brazil implemented this, I believe in 2003, and then Colombia also implemented the teaching of basically of Black history in schools. In terms of politics, Colombia has quotas for Blacks, but it doesn't, it doesn't always mean that you're going to get progressive Black politicians. Brazil doesn't have quotas for Blacks in politics. They have gender quotas. But in 2020, new legislation was passed in Brazil that political parties they are required to give Afro-Brazilian candidates equal funding as non-Afro-Brazilian candidates. They also have to ensure that they get an equal share of free television time in terms of advertisements. And this was really pushed by Black activists such as Douglas Belchior and Benedita da Silva. Next slide. In terms of crises, so we've already seen some of the slides talking about poverty and education, but in addition to those things, there's police brutality. Of course, I've mentioned poverty. And then of course, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to talk a little bit about Brazil And in 2016, Brazilian police killed 4,224 people. And we can compare that to the United States, where 963 people were killed the same year. And for the United States, 54% of that 963 were Asian, Black, Latinx, or Hispanic, Native American, and Pacific Islander. So, it's basically 54% of people of color. In 2019, Brazilian police killed 4,353 people. 75% of those killed were Afro-Brazilian. So you can see not only, of course, the percentage is much higher, but the actual number is much higher. And that's compared to 1,099 people in the USA. And of course, I'm sure in both cases, these are undercounts, but you can still see there's a dramatic difference between the number of people being killed. A lot of this in Brazil is due to military takeover of neighborhoods. And that was actually supposed to stop in places such as Rio. But this still happens where you actually have military coming into low-income communities and literally just indiscriminately killing people. So this is how you have innocent children and just innocent people in general getting killed because they just go in shooting. The pandemic has also been really devastating in Brazil. Afro-Brazilians are 40% more likely to die of COVID-19 than white Brazilians. Excuse me. There is also political repression in Brazil. Excuse me. So Marielle Franco was assassinated in 2018. And she was a very well-known Black queer woman, activist, politician who was fighting for the rights of women, of Black people, low-income people, youth, LGBTQ people. And she was also fighting against the military takeover of low-income communities in Rio. And so she faced a lot of threats and unfortunately was assassinated. Other activists and politicians continue to be threatened in Brazil. So this political repression continues to be a problem in Brazil. Next slide. I'm not going to spend too much time on their president, but he, has said derogatory things about a number of groups, Quilombo people or Quilombola people, so Black people, LGBTQ people, but it's not only that he's made these derogatory statements, he also has really done some devastating things in the country, such as not believing in science, not encouraging people to wear masks, not really fighting against the pandemic, which has really led to a genocide of Brazilians, especially indigenous and Afro-Brazilian people. Next slide. So now I want to talk again more about resistance and mobilization. So, and especially resistance to police brutality. So there are many groups in Brazil, but I just want to mention some. So one is Reaja ou Será Morto, or React or Be Killed, which was created in 2006. There's also the Coalition of Black Rights, which was created after the election of their current president. And this is a coalition of over 180 Black movement groups in Brazil. And they have really done a lot of work to speak out against, regressive policies of their president, to also to really be out on the front line, to step in where the state should be stepping in, but to make sure that that people suffering from the pandemic have food and things like that. So what I want to do now is we're going to play two clips. And the first one is just showing a mobilization against police brutality in Salvador, Bahia, which is 80% Afro-Brazilian. And then the second one is just showing the conference of the Coalition of Black Rights.
Nem um passo atrás! Contra o genocídio do povo negro! Nem um passo atrás! Avante!
Nesse momento aqui é porque nós acreditamos que esses meninos estão conosco, para que eles saibam que eles estão protegidos pela nossa fé e pela nossa esperança de que vai ter justiça. Chegamos.
Okay, that's good.
E aqui em pé, formando na frente da gente, são a tropa de frente.
And Pedro, you can stop it.
Adriano!
Thank you. I encourage you all, if you want to watch any of these, please do. That one was about, as they mentioned, these 12 young people who were killed in Salvador da Bahia. Okay, the next one, please. And we'll just watch about a minute.
O primeiro encontro internacional da Coalizão Negra por Direitos aconteceu na ocupação 9 de julho, que é um território importantíssimo de resistência e de vida comunitária. No primeiro dia, vieram entidades de 20 estados brasileiros, 100 pessoas representando dezenas de instituições do movimento negro.
E foi dentro do MNU que nos anos 90, na primeira metade dos anos 90, eu ouvi falar sobre um projeto político do povo negro para o Brasil. Né? Foi o MNU que trouxe essa discussão do projeto político do povo negro para o Brasil pela primeira vez. E é importante que a gente relembre o tempo todo isso. O movimento negro não está chegando agora na discussão de um projeto político para esse país. E sempre foi dito que não era um projeto de um Brasil para pretos. Era um projeto do povo negro para o Brasil como um todo.
Nós não vemos possibilidade de avançar no...
Thank you. Great. So again, sometimes you see a lot of media that's saying things like, oh, Black Lives Matter came to Brazil, or Black Lives Matter came to, whatever Latin American country. But again, Black Lives Matter was started, I believe, in 2013. And you can see that React or Be Killed started in 2006, right? So African descendants have always been organizing throughout Latin America. So I just want us to make sure that we keep that in mind. Next slide. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about transnational alliances and solidarity with social movements, especially Black social movement groups in Latin America. And I've seen a lot of this during the current pandemic, during the current crisis, which is why I wanted to mention it. So I am a member of the US Network for Democracy in Brazil. And I've been fortunate to be able to be in solidarity with groups in Brazil, including Black rights groups, such as the the Coalition for Black Rights in Brazil. So I just have a picture from a conference that Erica Larkins organized, and this was like right before the pandemic. It was February 2020. But it was a great time for activists from the US and Brazil to come together to discuss how we could all be in solidarity. Next slide. And then I wanted to close with this because this is a campaign that's going on now, and it's called Give Them Something to Eat. There are hungry people. And this has been supported by the Black Coalition for Rights, Amnesty International, a number of other groups. But what it's doing is really feeding hungry families in Brazil who have been really devastated by the pandemic. And so I'm encouraging everyone to donate to this. The exchange rate right now is about 5 to 1. So your US dollar goes a long way. So the website is there, but if you go to therearehungrypeople.com, it's very easy to donate using PayPal. So I just want to encourage everyone to do that. And again, that is one way that we can be in solidarity with African descendants in Latin America, and in this case, in Brazil. Next slide. Lastly, I want to say thank you, obrigada, gracias, for being with me and listening, on a whatever device you are using. I know that is not easy, especially on a Sunday. So thank you again. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Great, thank you so much. Let me open up the Q and so yeah, please either use the Q&A feature or the chat feature. We'll look at both and address them as needed. So, and I think so maybe I'll start with maybe an easier question. By the way, I love Issue the Blues. Is that song especially is so good. Can you maybe name some of your favorite musicians right now in Latin America? Well, in general, but
I mean, those were the one I played is definitely one. But of course, I still listen to some older music, like Elza Soares. So, and then just samba, and then again some older music like MC Racionais. I mean, old. So, but those are some of my favorites.
I'm typing up the names for people to take a look at it too.
Okay.
As well. So Elza Soares is also another.
Love her. She actually had a benefit concert during the pandemic with some others, and it was great.
Yeah. And I think it was 2 years ago they had a samba school that she was a theme, right? I think it was 2 years ago or last year. It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anybody having any questions for Dr. Mitchell-Walthour? And I'll have one more, and hopefully people can ask some questions. Can you talk a little bit about this evolution of Black identity in Brazil specifically, especially the last 20 to 30 years, because there has been a major shift in that sense?
Yes. I mean, I really think it's a continuation of what was already going on. But again, I think since it's happening in so many ways, I think that's what really allowed this shift, as well as affirmative action, right? So Afro-descendant students were able to go to university. They were exposed to different discourses and different experiences, right? So unfortunately, there are cases where people went to university and had professors who said racist things in the classroom. And then it was, when it was so explicitly racist, it was very difficult for people to justify that as, oh, well, this is due to my class or whatever, you know, when it was explicitly racist. So that was part of it. I think the kind of experience of education, and not just in the classroom, but like I said, being exposed to Black movement activists and rhetoric, even if they weren't involved in Black activism. So that was one. And then, like I said, through music, where, well, places like Sao Paulo, where not just music, but people actually having like hip hop events where young people, you know, were exposed again to these discourses that embrace Blackness. And then I'm even thinking about Rebecca Sobral's work in Salvador, Bahia, where she talks about Black women hip hop artists. The same thing, people addressing issues of race, gender, class, all of these things. So I think it was just really, you know, kind of this explosion of embracing Blackness through all of these very different means, right? Not just the kind of traditional activism that we think about in terms of, you know, people joining groups and going out into the street and things like that, but it happened in a lot of different ways.
So there's two questions here. I'm gonna first ask Manny Fernandez's question. Have groups like Heaja or others that you may want to discuss had an impact on policy, laws, and practices?
That's an excellent question. And I wish I could say yes, that they have, but I think it's more of, I mean, it's very difficult. So just like the clip mentioned, that people's lives were threatened and continue to be. I mean, I think of Marielle Franco. This was somebody who was well known, and it's still not clear who ordered her assassination. This is 3 years later, right? So if someone like that who was so outspoken, and then the states, Brazil as a country, still has not let the world know who ordered her death, that's a statement. That's saying that we don't value not only, you know, queer Black women, not only Black women, Black people, right? But we don't have to answer to your cause. If we want to go in and you know, commit genocides, you know, kill Black people, we don't have to change our policies and laws. So it's very difficult. So I do know that Black movement activists, they organized against the crime bill. So they were able to get some of those things changed. There was a crime bill that was going to make it even easier for, you know, police to kill people, and also to get guns in the hands of everyday citizens, which would just be extremely dangerous. So they were successful in doing that. But in terms of, you know, challenging some of these practices is very difficult, and especially in the type of political environment that Brazil is in now. So even when they had a leftist government, there was still lots of police brutality. So it's just a very difficult issue, and it's very difficult to get huge change. So that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you. That's actually a good segue to a question from Dr. Caroline Hossein. Can you speak about issues on carrying out research in this political climate? How do you choose your sites based on access?
That's an excellent question. So I was actually supposed to be in Brazil last summer on a Fulbright, but of course the pandemic came. So, and then in terms of what's going on in Brazil, that had to be deferred. So I can't go this summer either. So maybe 2022. But I actually think the other thing which I didn't get to highlight as much. So of course the pandemic is an extremely horrible situation, but I do think one of the things that I have seen is a lot of collaboration, not only among, you know, Brazilian scholars and activists, but also transnational collaboration. So I have been on panels, but also I've attended panels of, you know, scholars in the US, African scholars, Brazilian scholars and activists, where people hold webinars or there's a channel called Pensar Africanamente, Think Africanly. And she actually started the channel during the pandemic, and she has had some wonderful panels. And again, you know, some are only Brazilians, but then there are others where you just see all of this cross collaboration. So in terms of research, I'm working on a bunch of different projects. So one, I already have research from when I was, or I already have data from when I was in Brazil in 2018. But there's another project that I'm actually looking at how Black feminists are really, how they are using digital media, basically to do exactly what I was talking about, all of these cross collaborations, so across country. And a lot of that really did pick up during the pandemic. I mean, there has just been an explosion of these panels. So for me, I am able to do work since that is one of my projects.
Awesome. And you also answered Paxton Williams' question that was, what are you hoping to research in the future? So the next question is from Evelyn, I think Nadeau. I was wondering if you have come across coalitions made up of Afro-Latinos, Latin Americans, First Nations people. I remember when Berta Cáceres of Honduras was assassinated, I learned for the first time of her people's collaboration with the Garifuna. People were also involved in agricultural environmental issues. So what is that connection there?
That's a great question. So I will speak from my perspective as one of the national co-coordinators of the USNDB with Jim Green. And so I have seen that. So I have seen collaborations between Native Americans in the US and indigenous groups in Brazil. And of course, through other organizations, you also see that in other countries, but I've seen that. And then also the Washington, Brazil office organized a meeting of Deb Highland, I'm sorry if I mispronounce her name, and some indigenous leaders from Brazil. Well, that was pre-COVID. But I have seen those collaborations, and I've seen collaborations with people from the movement Without Land in Brazil and indigenous people and groups in the US. Now, in terms of Latinx people, there has been some, but I've seen more of, kind of indigenous groups and other indigenous groups, in each country.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, and with mentioning the Garifunas, I also remind myself of the complexity of this, right? Because the Garifunas were brought here, but they're basically First Nations people. They've been there for a long time. And then you think about the quilombolas in Brazil, it's the same thing. And there's a lot of mixing going on there too, because quilombola communities were not just enslaved Africans who were in a way, but also poor people and indigenous people who were escaping. So that was a very interesting kind of connection there too. So
yes.
Let's see here. Elia asked if Black people voted for Bolsonaro, and if so, are they still supporting him?
Okay, so unfortunately, I think it's over 50%, so I don't know the exact percentage, but over 50% of Afro-descendants voted for Bolsonaro. Now, in the Northeast, Fernando Haddad won, so Bolsonaro didn't. And the Northeast, I should mention, is mainly Afro-Brazilian. But when you look, when you kind of total up all those numbers in the country, a lot of people did. And one of the there are a number of reasons, but some of the reasons are that he really pushed this tough on crime, type of stance. And for some people, especially in low income communities, some people bought into that, so they were like, well, basically I want to feel safe. So, yes, I do think there should be tough on crime. But of course, when you see the numbers of people killed by police, including lots of innocent people, right? So even the tough on crime stance is one to say, oh, we need to get rid of gangs and drugs and drug dealers and things like that. But you get a lot of innocent people who are being killed. So that was one reason. I think the second reason is that he also kind of pushed this very conservative, evangelical Christian perspective or stance or attitude. And so you also have some Afro-descendants who are, and I'm not saying that all Christianity or all Christians are conservative. That is definitely not true, but I'm talking about a certain type, the very conservative evangelicals. And so he appealed to those. And of course, some evangelicals are also Afro-Brazilians. So those are just two, I think two of the reasons that people voted for him. Of course, there may be others. We could also talk about this whole disinformation campaign through WhatsApp, where just crazy, conspiracy theories were spread. And those, everybody read those, not just Afro-Brazilians, but like all Brazilians read those. Of course, not everybody believed those, but for some people, they might read a meme and then that's already, stuck in their head. He had this whole very homophobic stance. And so some people bought into that.
Mm-hmm. And also the intersectionality of the Bolsonaro vote, and then the cognitive dissonance of some of those voters is, and again, this happens in any presidential campaign, basically in any country, but it was very interesting to see, like from the outside, almost, that happening. So
yes.
So Max Kiwi has a question. Could you speak more about the Afro-Colombian history curriculum that you mentioned? Do you know how well it has been implemented, and does it dig deeper into questions of structural racism?
That's an excellent question. And I'm going to refer you to Tiana Pachel's excellent book, Becoming Black Political Subjects, because she is more of the expertise on that. So I don't want to offer an answer that's not actually giving you exactly what you're looking for, but I would definitely check out Tiana Pachel's book. That's her area of expertise.
And then, so Kristen Wiley, hi Kristen, had the question. She's my co-author of many years. Building on that important question about policy impact, how can these organizations parlay their mobilization power into electoral power? Are these movements aligned with or more distant from political parties?
No, that's a great question. So I was, looking at the 2020 municipal elections in Brazil, and there were, so there's still this, what people are calling the Marielle effect, where you have more Black women running for office. And so Erica Hilton is a Black trans woman who was elected in Sao Paulo. There was this kind of coalition of, I think, 5 or 6 people. I think it was called Periphery Quilombo. I can't remember the name of the group, but they were in Sao Paulo, and they came from an activist background, and they were elected. And so then you also have, other Black activists who ran for office. And so you do have people with, who are actually coming from activist backgrounds and running for office. They don't always win. A lot of times people don't win, but some do. So I have seen more of that. But again, it's still very, very difficult to be elected. I do think there is an impact. And so the thing that I mentioned before in terms of this legislation that political parties have to give Afro-Brazilians and non-Afro-Brazilians equal funding, that is something that was pushed by Benedict da Silva, who has been in politics for a very long time, but also Douglas Belchior, who is a Black movement activist and who ran for office before and didn't win. And he ran, he was running in a leftist political party. So it's even leftist political parties that weren't giving the same funding to, to Black candidates, which makes it really difficult. So, so there has been impact. Again, it's just, these things are very slow and you kind of have to start there and then, continue to build.
Yep. And from a gender perspective, since Kristen's here, is her book.
Very nice.
Women's Power. It's really good. I strongly recommend. And in Brazil specifically with the electoral process, we just recently start having demographic data on race on candidates. So that's going to be a lot of good research coming out in the next few years, trying to make this connection.
Exactly.
So Abdi Ali has a question. So the Black experience with systemic racism is global. How is the movement for Black Lives Matter in the US shaping and influencing the Afro-diasporic solidarity within Latin American Black communities?
That's an excellent question. So again, what I have seen, and so even in the clip that I showed from the React to Be Killed in Brazil, one of the people walking in that crowd was a young woman who, I don't think she's from Chicago, but maybe she lives in Chicago now. So, there's already this kind of transnational activism, right? So, so she was marching with that group, and then they have relationships with Black movement activists here. Again, during the pandemic, I've actually seen, and some of this existed before, right? So even the Black Coalition for Rights, the meeting that they had, their first international meeting, they brought in activists from, I believe, South Africa, the United States, Jamaica. So they brought in Black activists from different countries. And then in terms of what's going on now, I've seen panels and I've also organized panels between Black Lives Matter activists. For example, there was a panel with a Black Lives activist leader in Chicago with Black movement activists in Brazil. So there's this exchange between the two. And like I said, even before the pandemic, there had already been exchanges between between Black Lives Matter activists in Brazil or in the US and Brazil. But again, I just want to make sure that we keep in mind that, throughout Latin America, they have already had these groups, but then they are just, really continuing to do what Black people have done for many years, which is to create and maintain transnational solidarity.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Meg has a question. Can you talk about the origin of the expression, the Black grandma is in the closet, that is used to deny or ignore African ancestry?
Yeah, so that is, people often talk about that in books, but it's basic, it's very similar to the one of having a foot in the kitchen, right? So derogatory racist, but just something common used in Latin America, where people are trying to denote that, they had a Black relative. And again, most of the time when people are saying this, it's usually to try to justify why they aren't racist or why somebody in their family isn't racist, because they'll say, I had a grandmother or, someone else in their lineage who was Black.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's different expressions that are very similar, right? So
yes,
the foot in different places and different suggestions. Yeah, that's
yes.
Stacy Holt-Saros is asking for you to talk a little bit more about your most recent book and your intersectional approach to racial identity and politics.
Great. Yeah. So in the book, in the chapters, I look at the notion of Black group identity in Brazil. And so many scholars have done this in the US. So Michael Dawson has this notion of Black linked fate, which is the idea that African Americans will, they will view themselves as part of the group because they think, well, what happens to an individual Black American has an effect on me. So for example, if I'm demonstrating linked faith, I might think that what happened to George Floyd is relevant to me because I'm Black, right? So I might support certain social and racial policies as a group, even if the social policies don't really benefit me. So I was interested to see if something like that existed in Brazil. I didn't see anything like that in the political science literature. And so what I did is I had a similar question, but of course using the Portuguese category, negro for Afro-Brazilians. And I found in the cities that I considered Salvador, Sao Paulo, and Rio, and again, in the communities in those cities, I found pretty high levels of what I call negro linked faith. And then the other thing that I did, which is different from the literature here, is most of it is just, survey work. So I have the survey, but then I also have qualitative in-depth interviews to ask people, well, why is it that you feel that way? And many people talked about discrimination. They also talked about social exclusion. And so it was really interesting to me to see how two, very different countries, but countries with, a history of enslavement, how they were similar in that way. And then the other thing I did was for those who demonstrated linked faith through statistical analysis, I also found that they were more supportive of racial policies, such as affirmative action, which, in that way, I'm not saying that Brazil and the US, that they're both the same, but I'm saying in terms of linked faith and then support for racial policies, they're pretty similar.
Awesome. So please ask more questions. I have, especially given this question, I have one more question for me to you, but please keep asking questions. I still have a few more minutes. So my question is, how did you get interested in Brazil? Like, what was the connection there?
That's a great question. So when I was an undergrad at Duke, I was already interested in Latin America and I started traveling to Latin America. And then my second year, I took a class by John French on Afro-Brazilian history and culture. And after that class, I knew I wanted to study Brazil. I didn't know what exactly I was going to do. I was actually interested in more activist work and development work, but I knew that I would do something in Brazil. So it's really been a delight for me to kind of get to do both things, to be a researcher, but then through my work with the US NDB to really do the more activist work that I was interested in. So yeah, that is how I became interested in Brazil.
Can you talk more about US NDB for those that
Yes. Yes, of course. So we just had our third national conference. It was started December 2018. As people saw that it wasn't looking good for Brazil in terms of who might become president and then who did become president. So people began organizing. And what we did is in the first meeting, which Jim Green organized, is we came up with working groups. So we have Afro-Brazilian rights working group, a religion working group, LGBTQ+, rural rights, labor, and we've done a number of activities and events. We were also able to open the Brazil Washington office. And this has really been great because the US Congress people have been in contact with Brazilian Congress people. So that's more of the policy part, which has really been rewarding to see that and, and then to be involved in. I organized a panel with Aniele Franco in March, Marielle Franco's sister. And last week I had a meeting with one of her staff about, more solidarity work. So it has just been really rewarding for me and, and for all those involved. And I welcome anyone else who wants to become involved, you can just Google U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil.
Yeah, I shared the link on the chat for everybody too. So. Let's see here. I think that was, I think Kathy Golden may have a question, but I'm not seeing it yet here.
I'll say thank you for all my friends who are here and for my INCOPES family. I've heard some familiar names.
Yeah, so let's see. Okay, so Bruce Campbell has a question here. Do you see forms of organizing and coalition building in Brazil that you don't see in the US?
That's an excellent question. I guess it would depend. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, you know, I see lots of organizing in both countries. And I was thinking about the Mothers of May in Sao Paulo, which is a group of mothers, mainly Black mothers, but not exclusively Black, who organize against police brutality. And then I was, you know, thinking, well, do we have something like that in the US? But we do, but I don't, like, I wouldn't be able to name the group, but I do know that mothers, that Black mothers in the US have come together, you know, when their sons and daughters were killed. So I know that they have those type of groups there. I will say that what I've witnessed in Brazil is, and it's not that it doesn't exist here, because of course it does, like you know, the leaders, or the founders, I should say, the founders of Black Lives Matter were largely Black queer women. But a lot of the organizing that I see in Brazil is very intersectional, like at the outset, whereas in the US, I think, especially for cases of police brutality, we have to have this extra effort to make sure, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw's, you know, hashtag say her name. We had to have that because people were only talking about Black men who were killed, when of course Black women get killed too. But in Brazil, I think I don't want to say there's more. I would just say that I notice more kind of intersectional organizing and mobilizing. And just like I mentioned, you know, that some Black trans women have been elected in Brazil. I can't name any in the US, which doesn't mean we don't have any. I just can't name them. So yeah, I think and maybe it's because Brazil is closer to me in terms of what I study, that I see more of the intersectional activism.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, Meg Crosby wants to talk a little bit more about your book. How did you organize it, and how did you conduct the research? Did you interview Afro-descendants in Brazil on race and identity? And if so, how did you broach the topic with them, since talking about race can sometimes be a sensitive topic?
Great question. So what I always do in Brazil, except when I interview Brazilian politicians, I interviewed them. But when I have interviews with just, you know, everyday people, I always hire native Brazilians. So, and for the book, I have data from different years. So one was 2005 to 2006. But all of the people I hired were Afro-Brazilian. Well, no, they weren't Afro-Brazilian. They were all Brazilians, but not Afro-Brazilians. Whereas in the later research, they were Afro-Brazilians. And the way they introduced it is that we said, this is a study with Afro-descendants. Is there anybody who in your household who would like to participate? So even if people, you know, if they look like me, but said that they weren't, then we didn't interview them. We would say, oh, was there anybody else in your household who would like to do this interview? And then also we didn't classify them. So we had an open-ended question about race or color. What is your race or color? And so they chose it instead of the interviewer choosing what that was. And then after that, it was followed by, can you choose a census category? In some of the other research, I actually have skin tone. So we have a scale, and the person doing the interview was just able to check off the skin tone. So, and then, yeah, so we have that data, so we can tell, how the person, we can see if it was somebody, who was very dark skinned, but self-identified in another way. Now, in the case where we had somebody who did the interview, they identified as white, and the interviewer thought that they were white. I didn't count those interviews; those were thrown out. But there weren't many of those.
So, and where are those interviews conducted? So it's socioeconomic demographics. Is that a lot of more poor communities, or is that a mix?
Yeah, so what I did in the 2005 to 2006, that was actually when I was, still a PhD student. So I didn't have access to a lot of money or funding. So what I did is I met with people from the Brazilian Institute of Geography, and I got maps. And also I met with people from professors from UFBA and USP to help identify neighborhoods that were socioeconomically diverse, but also that had Afro-descendants, since I was limited in, where I could go. So that is how I determined the neighborhoods. And they, some were diverse in terms of the demographics, in terms of the economic demographics, and then some weren't. Some were very low income neighborhoods.
And I have a question. I don't know if you would be able to answer based on your research, and this is kind of my own personal experience growing up in Brazil. And I wonder if in lower income communities, people are more likely to associate themselves with Black or brown, pardo or preto than in middle class communities. And I speak as somebody who grew up in a lower middle class family, but in a middle class environment where it's not even that I was denied my Blackness in a way, right?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question and a great point. But what I found, which also Edward Taylor's in some of his work, is actually people with more education and more income. Those are the people that identify as Black or preto or negro. Whereas the people with lower education and lower incomes, those are the ones identifying, as morena or parda or, light brown or, the other non-Black categories.
Do not be Black.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I don't see any other questions here. Anybody have any last questions? We still have about 10 minutes. And we can end a little earlier. That's fine too. It's a Sunday. We can gain a few more minutes, but it'll be great if there's any other questions. I mean, and here's the thing, I could keep asking questions all day. So it's always better when there are other questions as well. I don't know, have you watched, this is related, but definitely more personal. Have you watched Emicida's documentary on Netflix?
I have not. I started it, but I haven't finished it. So I've only seen 5 minutes of it, but I've heard it's very good. Yeah.
So Emicida is a rapper in Brazil, and he has this documentary which is on Netflix, so anybody can watch it, called Amarelo. It's out for yesterday, and Emicida is a fascinating character too. And the whole documentary is trying to bring back Black culture and kind of reclaim some of the Black culture from the early 1900s and mid 1900s. I recommend. I watched it twice.
Okay, that's good.
And I think I may watch a third time.
The part I saw, I remember there was some like really fancy hall or building that he was having a concert in or something. So I think that's also related to, you know, what you are saying. It's like, okay, we should also be in these type of spaces.
Yeah,
right?
that's definitely significance of why he chose that building too.
Yeah, I have to finish it.
It was really good. Yeah, so no other questions. I'd like to thank you once again for joining us. This is great. And for everybody who is here, I know this is part of the NCCLA conference. I was hoping somebody else could, from the group, can put the link for the rest of the schedule up on the chat, so maybe we can take a look at it. So we'll have a full schedule tomorrow. And tomorrow night, we actually have another plenary about art and activism with some of our students here. It should be another interesting conversation. So thank you.
Very nice. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for all of these questions. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, and I see you all hopefully soon.
All right.
It's very nice to meet you.
Bye.
Mitchell-Walthour. Thank you very fantastic
You
presentation.
too. Thank you.